In episode 1, we opened with the temple in flames. Tonight, we're opening with a moment more than a century earlier when the door to that holy place was kicked in by a foreigner. Because the fire of 70 AD did not begin in 66 AD, it began in 63 BC when a Roman general walked where only the high priest was allowed to go. 63 years before Christ, a Roman general did the unthinkable. He pushed past the curtain into the room only one man on earth was permitted to enter. The high priest had a single appointment with that room every year on the Day of Atonement, and he came out trembling. Pompey just walked in, and Josephus tells us what happened next. And now Pompey, when he had pitched his camp at Jericho, marched against Jerusalem. The temple itself was on the strongest part of the city, and they had brought it to such a posture that they could hardly be taken in along siege. When Pompey came near to it, he wondered at the strength of the place, but more at the riches of it, and the order of its building. And being one of those who was very ambitious of glory, he was desirous to take Jerusalem. After he had taken many days about it, he made his approach to the very temple. He went into the Holy of Holies, where it was lawful for the high priest alone to enter, and he saw what was reposited therein: the candlestick and the lamps and the table and the pouring vessels and the censers, all made entirely of gold, and a great quantity of spices heaped together, with 2,000 talents of sacred money. But he touched nothing of all this on account of his regard to religion. And the next day he gave order to those that had charge of the temple to cleanse it and to perform their accustomed sacrifices. That was the moment. In 63 BC, a Roman general, Pompey the Great, walked into the most sacred room in the Jewish world, the Holy of Holies, the room where only the high priest was permitted, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement, Pompey just walked in. He didn't take anything, he didn't loot, he didn't desecrate the altar. Josephus is at pains to tell us how respectful he was. The door had been opened, the room had been seen by Gentile eyes. The fence around the Holy of Holies had been kicked over. In 63 BC, Rome undermined Jewish independence. Today in 2026, whispers of a third temple circulate amid rising tensions with Iran. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly knows how to rhyme. Now, before we get serious, let me tell you the part of the story that almost nobody teaches you in your church. Pompey expected to find a golden statue in the Holy of Holies. He'd been told stories, wild Roman rumors, that the Jews secretly worshipped the head of a donkey or kept a golden idol behind the curtain, or had a treasure room piled with sacred gold. Some Romans believed the Jewish God was just a particularly stingy mystery cult that the priests refused to advertise. So Pompey marched in expecting to find something, an idol, a treasure, a scandal. What he found was, and I'm quoting Roman historians here, empty. No idol, no god in any form he could recognize. Just the menorah, the table, the vessels, and a quiet stillness. Tacitus would later write, with what reads almost like embarrassment, that the Jewish temple contained, and I quote, nothing. Pompey walked back out, somewhat unsettled. He paid for the VIP tour, and the exhibit, as far as he could see, was closed. Even ancient Roman generals got temple tourism letdowns. Tonight we open the long road that runs from Pompey's moment to the moment when the temple itself would burn, from 63 BC to 70 AD. The world Jesus was born into, the world Josephus walked through, and the world we are, in our own century, watching being assembled all over again. This is episode 2 of The Fall of Jerusalem, Josephus and the End of the World. I'm Nat. Welcome back inside the walls. After Pompey walked back out of the Holy of Holies, the world he was leaving behind changed forever. Judea had enjoyed almost a century of independence. The Hasmonean dynasty, the descendants of the Maccabees we met in episode 1, had ruled their own kingdom since about 140 BC. Now, in 63 BC, that was over. It was technically the Jews' own fault. Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II had been at each other's throats for the crown. Each one sent envoys to Pompey, who was then commanding Rome's eastern legions in Damascus. Each one asked Pompey to come down to Jerusalem and settle the dispute in their favor. Pompey took one look at the situation and decided to settle it in his own favor. He marched on Jerusalem as Trabulus's faction barricaded themselves in the temple compound. The siege lasted 3 months. When the walls finally came down, Josephus tells us something genuinely haunting. The priests of the temple, watching Roman soldiers pour through the breach with swords drawn, did not stop performing the daily sacrifices. They kept burning the incense, kept pouring the drink offerings, kept reciting the prayers, and were cut down at the altar mid-ritual. 12,000 Jews died that day. Roman casualties were minimal. That is how Roman rule of Judea began. After Pompey, Judea was never sovereign again until the modern state of Israel almost 2,000 years later. It first became a Roman client state under puppet kings, including the Herod family, whom we will meet in the bonus episode of the House of Herod. And then, after Herod the Great's brutal son, Archelaus, was deposed in 6 AD, Rome placed Judea under direct rule by a series of governors called procurators. These were Roman administrators, posted from Rome, answerable to the emperor, and generally bad at their jobs. 5 names matter for this series, 5 names worth remembering. Pontius Pilate, procurator from about 26 to 36 AD, the man who washed his hands of Christ. Antonius Felix, procurator from roughly 52 to 60 AD, the man who held Paul under house arrest for 2 years in Acts 24, hoping the apostle would bribe him to be released. Porcius Festus, procurator from 60 to 62 AD, the man Paul's appeal passed all the way to Caesar in Acts 25. Lucius Albinus, procurator from 62 to 64 AD, the man on the road to replace Festus when the high priest Ananus seized the legal vacuum to execute James, the brother of Jesus. And we'll get back to that in just a moment. Jesus Florus, procurator from 64 to 66 AD, the man who, in 2 years, robbed the temple treasury openly, laughed at Jewish complaints, and lit the match that would burn the temple to the ground. Each one was, on average, worse than the last. By the time Florus took office, Josephus says he outdid every previous Roman governor in cruelty, which, given the field, is genuinely impressive. Florus managed in 2 short years to be hated more than every Roman governor before him. Put together, that is, and I'm being fair to the field, a real achievement. Now, pause on what just happened with the Hasmoneans. 2 factions inside one nation fighting each other so bitterly that they couldn't stop long enough to notice that a foreign superpower was about to walk through the door. They each thought winning the internal fight was worth handing the keys to Rome. Pompey did not even need to break in. Hyrcanus and Aristobulus held the door open for him. If that arrangement sounds at all familiar from the news of the last decade, it's not a coincidence. Across the Western world right now, governments tear themselves apart on partisan lines. Denominations tear themselves apart on culture war lines. Meanwhile, every major power on earth, China, Russia, the United States, the European institutions, the BRIC bloc, is positioning to take advantage of whichever nation weakens itself the most. Corrupt elites trade favors with foreign powers while ordinary people watch their institutions crumble. The same script with different costumes. The Hasmoneans fighting each other while Rome waited outside was basically ancient Game of Thrones, except in Game of Thrones, the players occasionally won. In the Hasmonean version, everybody lost, except the guy with the biggest legions. Now, before the war comes, and the war is coming, we have to understand who was inside the small, conquered, divided country. In episode 1, we walked through the three sects Josephus himself tried on as a teenager: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Tonight, we expand the map because by the middle of the first century, these three were no longer the only games in town. Two more factions had emerged, and one underlying philosophical movement which had been brewing for 50 years. 5 groups. Let me walk you through each. The Pharisees, the party of the oral law, strict traditionalists, popular with ordinary people. They believed the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, were divinely inspired and authoritative. They also believed that God had given Moses an oral tradition on Mount Sinai alongside the written one. Resurrection of the dead, angels, divine providence, all in. This is the world the Apostle Paul came up through. He calls himself in Acts 23 a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. His teacher, Gamaliel, was a Pharisee. So when you hear the Gospels speak of Pharisees, remember, Paul came out of that movement. So did several other figures of the New Testament. So did some of the most rigorous biblical scholars of the era. Jesus disagreed with them a great deal. He called some of them whitewashed sepulchres in Matthew 23:27. He dined in their houses. He debated them sharply, but on the resurrection of the dead and on the authority of the written scriptures, Jesus on paper stood with them. The Pharisees today are everywhere. They are religious people who major on minor things and miss the heart. The strict traditionalists who count the syllables of a prayer and ignore the suffering of a neighbor. Jesus diagnosed them at the source in Matthew 23, verse 24. Ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. Every Christian tradition has produced a generation of Pharisees somewhere in its lineage. Pick whichever stripe of religious leader you have personally watched argue about the color of the carpet in the fellowship hall while the marriages in the congregation quietly fall apart. That is the modern Pharisee. They are not always wrong, they're just always tone deaf. Now, the Sadducees, these are the aristocratic priestly class, rich, politically connected, comfortable with Rome. They held the temple, they held the high priesthood, they denied the resurrection of the dead, denied the existence of angels and spirits, and rejected the oral tradition entirely. They only accepted the written Torah, and they read it in the harshest possible literal sense. These are the people who tried to trap Jesus in Matthew 22 with the riddle about the woman who outlived 7 brothers. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be of the 7? It is a sneer disguised as a question. Jesus' reply lands harder once you know who he was talking to. You do err, not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God, he says in Matthew 22:29. These are also, and this is where it gets dark, the people who killed James, the brother of Jesus. I want to read you the actual passage Josephus writing for Roman readers with no theological reason to favor the early Christian movement, records what happened. In Antiquities of the Jews, Book 20, Chapter 9, Section 1, quote, "And now Caesar, upon hearing of the death of Festus, sent Albinus into Judea as procurator. But the king deprived Joseph of the high priesthood and bestowed the succession of the dignity on the son of Ananus, who was also himself called Ananus. This younger Ananus, who, as we have told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He thought he now had a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and such as were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. That is how James, the brother of the Lord, the leader of the Jerusalem church, the author of the Epistle of James, died, stoned to death by a Sadducee high priest who exploited a 3-week gap in Roman oversight to do what he had wanted to do for years. The most fair-minded citizens of Jerusalem, most of them likely Pharisees, were so disturbed by what Ananus had done that they secretly wrote to the incoming Roman governor, Albinus, to stop it. Even King Agrippa was horrified. Ananus was removed from the high priesthood within 3 months. That is what the Sadducees did when they thought no one was watching. The Sadducees were the ancient version of the wealthy religious class that knows the right politicians, attends the right galas, and lives nothing like the people who fill the pews. The prosperity gospel megachurch pastor who lunches with senators and flies private. The denominational executive whose theological convictions move whichever way the donor base moves. The ecclesiastical opportunist who can quote scripture but does not really believe most of it, including the part about the resurrection. And here is the chilling bit. The Sadducees believed they were protecting the temple. They thought collaboration with Rome was the wise, pragmatic course. They thought the radicals would ruin everything. They were, in their own minds, the responsible religious leadership. The temple they were protecting burned down in 70 AD. The Sadducees as a party did not survive it. Nobody remembers a single Sadducee theologian by name today because they had no theology worth remembering, only an institution worth defending. The Sadducees were basically the ancient version of the prosperity gospel megachurch pastor who lunched with the Roman senators, politicians. Now, the Essenes were the desert ascetics. We met them in episode 1. Celibate, communal, sharing all possessions, washing themselves in cold ritual baths, copying scrolls in caves, the community most scholars associate with the Dead Sea Scrolls. However, there is a conspiracy that the Dead Sea Scrolls are not as ancient as we think they are. I'm not going down that rabbit hole, but I encourage you to do your own research. Anyway, they were pure, devoted, apocalyptic, and entirely withdrawn from the rest of Jewish society. The Essenes saw the corruption of the temple, looked at the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and decided the whole project was beyond saving. They left for Qumran. They wrote their library. They waited for the end. Every generation of Christians has produced an Essene impulse, the off-grid believer who has decided the institutional church is corrupt, past redemption, and the only faithful response is to homestead in the hills and wait for the Lord. The Christian prepper, the intentional community that has cut itself off from any meaningful engagement with surrounding culture. The fundamentalist enclave that refuses to read any book published after a certain year. They are sometimes sincere, they are sometimes admirable, and I'm not going to lie, I sometimes wish I was one of them. And in 70 AD, when Jerusalem burned and the institutional temple was destroyed, their scenes were also wiped out. The Romans found their community at Qumran, killed them, and burned their settlement. Withdrawal did not save them either. Now, for a new group, I'll add to the mix the Zealots and their underlying philosophical roots. When Judea was placed under direct Roman administration after the deposition of Archelaus in 6 AD, Rome ordered a census for the purpose of taxation. To a faithful Jew, the census itself was offensive. Numbering the people of God was something only God was allowed to do, and even then carefully. King David's census in 2 Samuel 24 brought a plague on Israel, but the tax on the census was theologically unbearable. Paying tribute to Caesars required acknowledging Caesar as a kind of lord. To certain Jews, that was idolatry. Their leader was a man named Judas the Galilean, also called Judas of Galilee. He is named in the New Testament in Acts 5:37 in a speech by Gamaliel. After this man rose up, Judas of Galilee, in the days of taxing, and drew away much people after him. He also perished, and all, even as many as obeyed him, were dispersed. Judas the Galilean is also the man Josephus identifies as the originator of what Josephus calls the fourth philosophy. Josephus's own terms for what he considered a dangerous innovation in Jewish thought. Their motto, in essence, was, quote, no king but God, unquote. No human ruler, no foreign tribute, no compromise. Faithful violence was the path to deliverance. Jesus knew this movement well. One of his 12 apostles was a zealot. Simon Zelotus, named in Luke 6:15, was part of the inner circle that Jesus had. He was a former member of an armed insurgent faction. And yet, when the crowds tried to make Jesus himself into a zealot-style political king after the feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6, verse 15, Jesus departed again into a mountain himself alone. He walked away. He refused the offer. Finally, the Sicarii, the dagger men, by the 50s AD, were a splinter group that had emerged from the Zealots. The Sicarii, named for the seeker, the curved Roman dagger they used, were the assassins. They specialized in killing in crowded public places, slipped the dagger in under the rib, vanish into the crowd before anyone realized what had happened. They targeted Romans, but more often they targeted Jews they considered collaborators, Sadducee priests, wealthy Hellenizers, anyone who, in their view, was making peace with the wrong side. The Sicarii are going to hold a fortress called Masada to the bitter end. We will come back to them in episode 7. The Zealots are the militant nationalists of every century since, the ones who believe that the only faithful response to compromised institutions is to burn them down and rebuild them from the ashes, by force, by purge, by the dagger if necessary. They're not always wrong about the corruption they are diagnosing. They are almost always wrong about the cure. In our own time, you can see zealot energy in many places, in militant religious nationalism on multiple continents, in armed political religious movements that believe holy violence will bring about the messianic age, in Christian and post-Christian movements that talk seriously about civil war as a cleansing event, in voices on every side of the political spectrum who have concluded the institutions are too far gone and only the dagger or the dollar or the digital purge will fix things. I guess they all missed. Blessed be the peacemakers. The zealots fought hard. They fought bravely. They fought in their own minds for God. And when the dust settled in 73 AD, every one of them was dead, and the temple they had been trying to defend was gone. Holy violence is the strategy that always loses, eventually to a bigger army. Now, to one of the most quietly extraordinary moments in all of ancient literature. Josephus, writing for a Roman audience in his 20-book history called Antiquities of the Jews, mentions by name three figures from the New Testament: John the Baptist, James, the brother of Jesus, and Jesus himself. We've already met James. Let me read you what Josephus said about John. This is Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Chapter 5, Section 2. Now, some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly as a punishment of what he did against John, that was called the Baptist. For Herod slew him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness towards one another and piety towards God, and so to come to baptism, for that the washing would be acceptable to him, if they made use of it, not in order to the putting away of some sins, but for the purification of the body, supposing still that the soul was thoroughly purified beforehand by righteousness. Now when many others came in crowds about him, for they were greatly moved by hearing his words, Herod, who feared lest the great influence John had over the people might put into his power an inclination to raise a rebellion, for they seemed ready to do anything he should advise, though it best by putting him to death to prevent any mischief he might cause. Accordingly was sent a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle I mentioned before, and was there put to death. That is a non-Christian historian writing roughly 60 years after John's death, calling him a good man, a teacher of virtue, describing his baptism, and naming the political reason for his execution. The gospel writers Mark chapter 6 and Matthew chapter 14 give us the moral reason. Herod Antipas had married his brother Philip's wife, Herodias, in defiance of Mosaic law. John publicly called it sin. Herodias never forgave him. Her daughter Salome danced for Herod on his birthday. Herod swore a foolish oath. Herodias asked for John's head on a platter, and John was beheaded in his cell at Machaerus. Josephus gives us the political effect. John's preaching was drawing huge crowds. Herod became frightened of those crowds. Crowds in the first century Judea had a way of becoming armies. Both accounts are true. Moral confrontation always has political consequences in a system that is not interested in being morally confronted. The Testimonium Flavianum, now the third reference, the most contested paragraph in all antiquity, Josephus' mention of Jesus himself in Antiquities, Book 18, Chapter 3, Section 3, the version that has come down to us through the manuscript tradition reads, in part, quote, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah, and when Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Now, most scholars believe Christian copyists in late antiquity touched up some of those phrases. Josephus was a Pharisee, not a Christian. He would not have written, quote, he was the Messiah, unquote, as a flat statement. He would not have written, quote, if indeed one ought to call him a man, unquote. But, and this is the part that gets buried in academic footnotes, a 10th century Arabic manuscript discovered in the 1970s preserves what looks like a less embellished version of the same passage. It reads, quote, "At this time there was a wise man called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, perhaps he was the Messiah, concerning whom prophets have recounted wonders." Unquote. This is the version most scholars believe is closest to what Josephus originally wrote. And even that stripped down version tells us from a first century Jewish historian who was not a Christian that Jesus lived and he taught that he attracted disciples, that he was crucified by Pilate, and that his followers reported him alive 3 days after his crucifixion. For my Christian listener, this is the headline. The gospel writers were not making things up, but you know that already. A historian who had no theological reason to favor the early Christian movement recorded the same basic facts, the uncanny parallel. And yeah, we step lightly. It's the pattern itself. A charismatic teacher draws crowds. The authorities become uneasy. The teacher's death does not stop the movement. The movement persists, despite, or perhaps because of, the persecution. That dynamic is alive in every century since. The teachers change, the empires change, the pattern never changes. Jesus was right. Now, to one of the most quietly devastating cross references in the New Testament. On the Mount of Olives, just outside Jerusalem, Jesus sat with 4 of his disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, and described in detail what would happen between his ascension and his return. The conversation is recorded in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. The very first warning out of his mouth, before he mentions wars, before he mentions famines, before he mentions persecution, is this. And Jesus answered and said unto them, "Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." He says it again 8 verses later, "And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many." And a third time, "For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect." Matthew 24. 3 times in one chapter, be deceived by no one. Many false Christs will come, many false prophets will come. And then, within 20 years of his crucifixion, Josephus started writing the names down. Theudas, around 44 to 46 AD, drew crowds into the wilderness, promising he could part the Jordan River the way Moses had parted the Red Sea. Josephus describes him this way in Antiquities, Book 20, Chapter 5, Section 1. Now it came to pass, while Thaddeus was procurator of Judea, that a certain magician, whose name was Theudas, persuaded a great part of the people to take their effects with them and follow him to the river Jordan. For he told them he was a prophet, and that he would, by his own command, divide the river and afford them an easy passage over it. And many were deluded by his words. However, Thaddeus did not permit them to make any advantage of his wild attempt, but sent a troop of horsemen out against them, who, failing upon them unexpectedly, slew many of them, and took many of them alive. They also took Theudas alive, and cut off his head and carried it to Jerusalem. Theudas is also the man Gamaliel referenced in Acts chapter 5 when he was advising the Sanhedrin to leave the early Christians alone. For before these days rose up Theudas, boasting himself to be somebody, to whom a number of them, about 400, joined themselves, who were slain, and all, as many as obeyed him, were scattered and brought to naught. Acts 5:36. A non-Christian historian and the book of Acts, written independently, describe the same dead man. The cross-reference is extraordinary. A decade later, an unnamed Egyptian prophet led thousands of followers up to the Mount of Olives, the same hill Jesus had wept from in Luke chapter 19, and promised that at his command the walls of Jerusalem would fall down flat. Felix sent an army. Most of the followers were slaughtered. The Egyptian himself escaped and was apparently still at large years later. Josephus tells the story in Antiquities, book 20, chapter 8, section 6. But there was an Egyptian false prophet that did the Jews more mischief than the former, for he was a cheat and pretended to be a prophet also, and got together 30,000 men that were deluded by him. These he led round about from the wilderness to the mount, which was called the Mount of Olives, and was ready to break into Jerusalem by force from that place. And if he could but once conquer the Roman garrison and the people, he intended to domineer over them by the assistance of those guards of his that were to break into the city with him. But Felix prevented his attempt and met him with Roman soldiers, while all the people assisted him in his attack upon them, insomuch that when it came to a battle, the Egyptian ran away with a few others, while the greatest part of those that were with him were either destroyed or taken alive. This one too is in the New Testament. When Paul was arrested in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 21, the Roman commander who arrested him initially mistook Paul for the Egyptian. The commander's first question to Paul was, "Art thou not the Egyptian which before these days madest an uproar and led us out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers?" Acts 21:38. Paul had to explain that no, he was not the Egyptian. He was a Roman citizen from Tarsus. The numbers differ slightly between Josephus and Acts, and obviously we take Acts as the truth. This is normal, though, for ancient sources counting crowds. The man and the event are the same. Josephus tells us that these two were not alone. He mentions briefly a steady stream of impostors under Felix. Quote, "Impostors and deceivers persuaded the multitude to follow them into the wilderness, pretending that they would exhibit manifest wonders and signs that should be performed by the providence of God." Under Festus, more of the same. They kept coming, they kept dying, and the people kept following the next one. Jesus' warning has never stopped applying. Every generation produces false messiahs. They look different in different eras. Sometimes a political savior, sometimes a celebrity pastor, sometimes an end times prophet, drawing online crowds with apocalyptic dates and supernatural promises. But the pattern is identical in Theudas and the Egyptian. A South African pastor on YouTube declared in September last year that Jesus had appeared to him 3 times, confirming the rapture, which would happen on the 23rd and 24th of September 2025. The video went viral on TikTok. Millions of posts, millions filming themselves preparing, people making farewell videos for relatives they assumed would be left behind. Some quit jobs, some sold property, some told their children mum and dad would not be there when they came home from school on the 24th. I mean, really? Then the 24th came and went, and the rapture did not happen. The pastor's social media went quiet. The children were told something else. The damage was done. I literally saw the other day on X an African gentleman trying to part the sea like Moses did. It never ends. It just circles around. These were obviously not the first. William Miller did it in 1843. Edgar Whisenant published 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. Harold Camping picked the 21st of May 2011, then revised the Revelation 12 sign craze of September 2017. Every generation produces its own version, and every generation the date passes. There's no new thing under the sun. At least Theudas only promised to part the Jordan. The modern ones promise private jets and thus saith the Lord stock tips. Jesus warned us 4 times in one chapter, and here we are. Now we come to the part of the episode that will land hardest for some of you, and probably the part most worth your attention. Throughout the Jewish war, the book this whole season is walking through, Josephus argues something Roman readers would have found surprising. He argues that the destruction of the temple was not fundamentally a Roman achievement. It was Jewish self-destruction made possible by Roman force. Josephus believed God had withdrawn his protection from the temple because of the internal moral and factional collapse of the Jewish nation. The Zealots and the Sicarii had turned the holy city into a slaughterhouse of fellow Jews long before the Romans set fire to the sanctuary. The Sadducees had let the priesthood become a political instrument. The competing factions inside Jerusalem had, in the final months of the siege, burned each other's grain stores, the grain that would have fed the besieged for years. We will see all of that in episode 5 and 6. For Josephus, the temple's destruction was a moral verdict on what its custodians had become. The Romans were the instrument, the judgment was God's. The modern push is rebuilding what burned in Jerusalem. The project of rebuilding the temple is no longer fringe. The Temple Institute, an organization in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, has spent nearly 40 years preparing for a third temple. They have woven the priestly garments to the exact specifications in Exodus. They have forged a gold menorah. They have built an altar. They have trained Kohanim, descendants of the priestly line, in sacrificial rites not performed for 2,000 years. In 2022, 5 red heifers were quietly transported from Texas to Israel and prepared for ritual sacrifice. According to the book of Numbers, chapter 19, ashes of a perfect red heifer, without spot, without blemish, never having borne a yoke, are required to ritually purify a person before they can enter the temple. No ashes, no temple. Inside the current Israeli governing coalition sits the Uzma Yehudit. Several of their members have publicly advocated for Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount and for the eventual rebuilding of the temple. These are not leaked memos, these are stated public positions. Here's the part of this story that the audience needs to understand and is almost never taught. Modern political Zionism as a movement to reestablish a Jewish state in Palestine traces in larger part to one man, Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian Jewish journalist born in 1860. The Herzl mentioned in this episode opens a bigger story. The full chapter, how a Hungarian-born journalist convened the first Zionist Congress in 1897 and reshaped the next 130 years, is on Substack as a paid bonus this season. It graduates to free for everyone else at the end of season 1. However, for context, we do have to delve a little into Zionism. After covering the Dreyfus affair in France and watching anti-Semitic crowds shout, quote, "Death to the Jews," unquote, in the streets of Paris, Herzl concluded that European Jews would never be safe without a homeland of their own. In 1896, he published a slim book called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State. In 1897, he convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. He died in 1904. decades before the modern state of Israel ever existed. But he is the man who set the political project in motion at almost exactly the same time. On the other side of the Atlantic, an American minister named Cyrus Ingerson Schofield was producing what would become one of the most influential single editions of the English Bible in the 20th century. Western Christianity became tantalized with the Schofield Reference Bible. And again, this also opens a bigger story how a complicated American minister published an annotated Bible in 1909 that shaped a century of Western Christian thinking about the end of the world. This is also on my Substack as a paid bonus this season and graduates to free at the end of season 1, so check that out if you want. For now, all you need to know is he was first published by Oxford University Press in 1909. His Schofield footnotes were printed on every page besides the King James text and popularized a particular reading of biblical prophecy called dispensationalism, a system that taught, among many other things, that ethnic Israel would be regathered to the land of Palestine, that a third temple would be rebuilt, and that these events were prophetic prerequisites for the return of Christ. Schofield was not the inventor of dispensationalism. That distinction belongs to the 19th century Anglo-Irish theologian named John Nelson Darby, but Schofield was its great popularizer. By the middle of the 20th century, his reference Bible had shaped 2 full generations of Western evangelicals. Here is where the 2 movements met. Herzl's secular political Zionism on its own did not have the votes or the lobbying power to deliver a Jewish state. Western evangelical Christianity, primed by Schofield, did, and saw in Herzl's project the literal prophetic restoration their footnotes told them to expect. The 2 movements wanted overlapping things for completely different reasons. Herzl wanted refuge. The Christian Zionists wanted a prophetic timeline. By the time the modern state of Israel was declared in 1948, that alliance was already shaping American foreign policy. By the time the Six-Day War of 1967 returned the old city of Jerusalem to Israeli control, the alliance was permanent. By the 21st century, Western Christian Zionist organizations were raising tens of millions of dollars annually and effectively running a wing of evangelical policy advocacy. Josephus, watching the Zealots and the Sicarii at work in his own day, recognized one thing clearly: apocalyptic certainty, the absolute conviction that God's hand was about to act, that the Messianic age was at the gate, that any compromise with present reality was treason, was the engine that drove Jerusalem off the cliff. Not Roman power, apocalyptic certainty. That engine is running today on multiple sides at once. Israeli right-wing movements convinced God's plan requires the Temple Mount cleared. Christian movements convinced the same temple must be rebuilt for prophecy to advance. Iranian political theology with its own apocalyptic register on the other side of the line, and underneath it all, an actual regional war that has, in the last 2 years, escalated to direct Iranian missile strikes on Israel soil and Israeli strikes on Iran and Gaza and now Lebanon. For the first time in modern history, many sincere believers on multiple sides genuinely think they are reading end times correctly. Some of them may be. Some of them are date setting and will be embarrassed when their dates pass. Some of them are providing theological cover for political projects that would, if they succeeded, trigger a regional war an order of magnitude worse than anything we have seen so far. A fun fact for this section, and it's not really fun. The second temple, one Josephus watched burn in 70 AD, was destroyed on the 9th of the Hebrew month of Av. The first temple, the one destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC, was also destroyed on the 9th of Av. Same date, 656 years apart. Josephus called it providence. In the Jewish calendar, the date is called Tish B'Av. In our Gregorian calendar, it shifts each year, late July or early August, because the Hebrew calendar follows the moon. In 2026, the year you are listening to this, hopefully, the 9th of Av falls on the 22nd of July. Modern Jews still fast on it. They still mourn on it. 2.5 millennia after Babylon, 2,000 years after Rome, same date every year. If you happen to believe a third temple is being assembled in our lifetime, is it worth asking yourself the question that nobody in the Temple Institute will say out loud? What date would that temple fall on? If we are not careful, we are going to end up with more factions than ancient Judea. Okay, let me bring this home. Tonight we walk through the world of Pompey, opened in 63 BC, the procurators who governed it badly, the factions who fought inside it, the false messiahs who exploited it, the cousin of Jesus Christ who baptized in its rivers, the brother of Jesus who was stoned in the courtyard, the long road by which an obscure piece of 19th century theology and an obscure piece of 19th century journalism became together a permanent feature of the 21st century geopolitics. The single sentence the audience needs to walk away with is this: division plus corruption plus false saviors plus apocalyptic certainty equals catastrophe. That was the equation in 64 AD. It is the equation today. Josephus has been trying to warn us in a book most Christians have never read for nearly 2,000 years. Next week, in episode 3, the spark that lit the fire, spring and summer of 66 AD. A riot in the port city of Caesarea on a Sabbath morning, a Roman procurator, Florus, marching into the temple treasury and helping himself, a young priest in Jerusalem who decided that, for the first time in nearly a century, the daily sacrifice for Caesar would not be offered. The Roman governor of Syria marching south at the head of an army and walking into a humiliation no one saw coming. And a quiet group of Christians inside the city who had heard the warnings their Lord had spoken on the Mount of Olives and who began, very quietly, to pack. And you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Matthew 24:6. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. I'm Nat, and this is the Fall of Jerusalem. See you inside the walls.